Right, good morning and welcome back to another lecture for web and mobile systems. In the last lecture, we had started our discussion regarding this demo project that we are building, which we call as the meme generator app. And the whole idea of the meme generator app, the design idea that we were going to follow is that there will be two input text fields wherein the users would be able to provide input regarding the top and bottom text of a meme image. And then there will be one button which will essentially generate the random meme image that the users will use in order to create their meme information, right? So that was the overall idea about the meme page. And then we had a header section in order to kind of give like a welcome message or a welcome banner for the prototype that we are developing. And then below that is where we will put this three aspects within our particular front-end UI. And the whole idea of this is to basically take a React project that we were working on, a project or a UI that is developed using React.js, and then kind of incorporate dynamic and interactive behavior within that particular project, right? So in doing so, the three main core functional aspects or concepts that we are learning through this particular demo is the idea. The first is the idea of React state management, which we will be kind of taking care of using a React hook that is known as useState. So we will kind of incorporate this. And then we need to kind of learn, or we will learn about how to use event listeners within a React project. And then finally, the idea of how to call APIs from our React project. So this will be like the generic window into integrating any kind of backend server calls from your front-end UI. So if you're ever working with a team of developers who are responsible for working with your backend, and then you are responsible for developing the front end, or you yourself are the full stack developer, and you need to have an understanding of how to connect the front end that you're developing using React.js to your backend. Well, that is essentially done through what we call as API calls, right? So in this project itself, we will learn that exposed component, which will, or the area where you can integrate different types of API calls with your project itself, right? And we discussed about the general design guidelines in the last class. We talked about what are the core components in setting up React state management. We talked a little bit about how to set up React event listeners, and we haven't yet touched upon API calls, but we hope to do that in today's lecture itself. So the way we will start this off is we will address each of these components individually first again, and this time we will talk about the syntax and not just the logic of how the implementation takes place. And thereafter, we will kind of integrate that information within our actual project or within our actual demo, which is to complete the meme generator app. So what we had achieved until the last class was basically create our header banner. Okay, so this was a custom component that we had developed in the form of header.js. So wherein we had some sort of a logo, and then we had some sort of a title for our web application, and then some sort of a banner message to kind of give some information or leading information regarding what this topic is going to be all about, right? And then you can use CSS to kind of arrange this in a much more constructive manner, using the knowledge of CSS that we have already gained to this point, using things like display flex and stuff like that. Okay, so the first thing that we will start off with is, of course, React state management. We already discussed about what is state management, why is it necessary in React.js, and how to set it up using useState, right? So we are going to do the same thing, but this time just focus on a much more smaller toy example rather than kind of integrating that to the overall project from the get-go. So to do that, what I'm going to do first is within my components, create another custom component. And we are going to call that custom component essentially something along the lines of the React State tutorial or something along those lines, right? So here in my terminal, I'm just going to change my directory into, so I'm in React demo. So I need to get out of React demo and I need to move to React State. Staking REACT STATE. So where am I? React State W23. Okay, we need to destroy this particular thing, create another split terminal. Let's see if this solves the minor error that we had. React State W2023, go into my app. And then within my app, we have all of our root directory packages and folders. So we will get inside of SRC. And then within SRC, we have a subdirectory called components, wherein we will create another component just to understand the implications of React. So React State Management. So we will say touch, and then we will create a new component here. And let's call it React State tutorial.js. So once we create this, we will go inside of that file. We will set up the boiler template and stuff like that, but we don't need the entirety of the boiler template. We just need to work with basically the whole idea of how to kind of incorporate state management, or what is the emphasis of state management within React itself, right? So we want to essentially build that up. So we are going to set up the boiler template first. So again, if you have the snippets activated, then we need something along the lines of a React functional component with an export statement. So once you set that up, this will generate our boiler template code. And then within this is where we will write the code that needs to be rendered by our UI. But outside of the return statement is where we will set up all the tutorial for React State Management. Okay, so that's essentially the goal of this particular component, is to just show or give us the ability to understand what state management is actually going to do. So again, as we discussed, if any values for objects and variables that are owned or that are internal to a particular custom component that you have declared, if those values are changing and you need a way to track those values, then essentially that is where you will need React State Management. Because if you do not use state management to track those values, then on your browser, when you are rendering this particular component, it will not be able to show us the value changes that are taking place, because React is unable to keep a track of it, right? So we need a way to use the state management to get this thing up and running. So what we are going to do is, first, we are going to set up a scenario wherein we will not use state management to kind of understand that why it doesn't work, or at least show that it doesn't work. So what we are going to do for that purpose is, we are going to take an array, and then we are going to increase the size of the array by maybe 1 index. So that means essentially we have an array of some sort of length, right? So here, let's just put out the design criteria. So let's say we have an original array which has 2 indexes, and the modification or update that we will perform on this particular array is add another index. Okay, so that means, let's say there is an existing array which consists of values 1 and 2. And the way we are going to modify this is we are going to add another element to it that is, let's say 3, as simple as it can get. But what you have to pay attention to is that the object value variable that we are trying to track within this custom component is basically this array itself, right? So the state of the array changes from having 2 different values to 3 different values, right? So essentially, if you just print this particular array on your, or try to render this particular array on your web browser, right? Or once it loads, then if you had increased the size of the array by adding 1 more index in a typical construct, like using HTML or vanilla JavaScript, this should show you that the array after the update operation has 3 different elements rather than its previous state, which was 2 elements, right? But if we do not use state management, if we simply treat the array as an array and just add another element and then just console log the array itself or print out the array itself. Print out here essentially means trying to render the element onto the web browser itself. Then we will see that we won't be able to notice the changes that are taking place. Okay, so that means within this, let us first of all, within this component, let us create the array. Okay, so in order to declare an array in JavaScript, we essentially just need to say constant array, give it a name. Okay, and then just declare the array within our third bracket. So here I can say that it's a string array. So the first item would be array item 1, and then we can create another item here, and we can say array item 2. Okay, and then we can just leave it as such for the initial declaration. Okay, and then to create the new array, what we can essentially do is run a map method, which is a higher order array method. And the utility of the map method is to basically recreate using the original array, a new array based on any kind of logic that we specify within this particular array, right? So that means we will create a new array element using the old array itself. And what that is going to do is going to take the old array as an input and then call on the map method. And the map method is going to take a callback function as input. So the only thing that we are going to create is basically an iterator over the map method itself. All right. So here within the map method, we will create an iterator which will be passed into the body of the callback function. So here, let us call that iterator to be some item. So this item will basically traverse over all of the existing indexes of the array to create basically the logic, or to create whatever the return of this particular callback function is going to be. That is whatever we want to return from this map method. Okay, this is a function at the end of the day. So this is expected to return something, but the function, instead of taking a simple parameter, it takes a callback function as an input parameter. And that callback function, the way we are setting it up is through the help of an iterator, which will allow us to go over each of the indexes of the array that we are passing to the map method. And then once it visits each and every index of the array, since this is a callback function, then there's going to be a function body. And in that function body, we will specify the logic of what we want to do when this iterator that we are passing as a parameter to the callback function visits each of those indexes. Okay, so what I will do here, the logic of the function that I want to create is basically the syntax, the JSX syntax that should be rendered when this array visits each and every index of the existing function. So I'm going to pass this to the logic of the function. And if it's a single statement function body, then I don't need curly braces to kind of wrap those different function body logic. So I only going to have a single statement. So I'm going to create a paragraph element, JSX element, which is a paragraph. And in the paragraph, whenever you are performing a map method on an array, or let's say on an array of objects, whatever that might be, one of the important attributes that is necessary amongst other attributes is to create a key attribute, right? So without that, you cannot perform the iterations. It's not that you cannot perform the iterations, but it's more along the lines of React will expect there to be a key attribute such that it can uniquely identify each and every different index of the array from each other, right? Because if this is going to iterate over the different indexes of the array, then when you pass this to React.js to be rendered onto the browser, then React also needs to know what is the identification parameter of all of these different indexes. Otherwise, React will not have a way to differentiate between these different elements of the array if you do not create a unique ID, right? So that is why whenever we perform map method, it will iterate over all of these items, right? And then we are creating a JSX-like syntax, which we hope to pass to React.js within this return statement that will be rendered on the UI. So we need to tell React, or we need to show React how to differentiate between these different items, because we as humans, we can see that these items are different because their values are different, their values might be same, but this is index 0, this is index 1, and this is what the map method is going to do. It's going to take this iterator and then visit each of this index and then do something. And this do something is basically going to be based on what we are specifying, some sort of a JSX syntax, which can then be passed within this return statement, and that can be then rendered onto the web browser, right? Or when it loads, it can be rendered by the web browser. So essentially, in order to tell React how to differentiate between different items, we need to create a key attribute in such a scenario, right? So the key attribute that we are going to be working with is basically to take the item itself. Okay, we are going to assign this to the item itself, and then that is going to make up for the identifier. Okay, and then within the identifier, what we are going to print is basically the value of the iterator. So the value of the iterator is going to be whatever value is present in these individual indexes when this iterator visits them. And then we are taking the index of those particular items to be the key, identifying key of those items. So that means when this paragraph entity needs to be printed, so this particular object will consist of two different paragraph elements, right? One for the first index, one for the second index. And eventually our goal is to take this and then pass it within the return statement so that it can be rendered on the UI. So React needs to know what is the difference between the first item versus the second item, right? So that is something that React should be familiar with. So in order to allow React to differentiate between these items, you always have to provide this key attribute as an input, whatever element type that you're using. It could be a paragraph tag, it could be a div tag, whatever the component that, or whatever HTML-like element that you're trying to generate. This is an important note that you have to keep in mind, that when using the map method in order to generate elements like this in an iterative fashion, you need to provide the key attribute. This is for React only, so that React can distinguish between all of these different indexes that is being iteratively generated. Okay, so next, what we want to do is we want to create a event listener based scenario wherein if we click a button within this particular component's logic, if we click a button, then it will add another new element to this existing array, right? So let us call that function that we are trying to generate as add item to the array itself, right? So in order to declare any function within JavaScript, we start with the keyword function. We give the function a name. So let us call it as add item, because that is basically intuitively the logic of the function that we will be working with. And the goal of the function is to take the array item. Okay, so here we have this array item. So we will create a string with this particular prefix, and then we will add a numerical value and then add that to the length of the array. That is, we will add it to a last index. So first we will create a variable that will have a string pattern, which is similar to this. And then we will take that variable and then we will use the array methods to kind of add this element that we are generating dynamically to the last index of the array itself, right? So what I mean by that is that I want to create a new variable first. So let's say const new item text. Okay, so I'm generating the string pattern that will be used, but in a dynamic way. And I'm going to use backticks because I don't want to use the string concatenation operator. The reason why we will need a string concatenation operator is because we have a text here, which is kind of the same for every item. But notice here that the number value at the very end changes based on the index of the array plus 1. Okay, so that means this is the 0th index, 0 plus 1, 1. First index, 1 plus 1, 2, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what we want to generate. So I will first specify the text that needs to be written at the prefix for the prefix. Then I'm going to use the dollar symbol, which will indicate that I have some sort of value that I want to kind of input in there. And then I will take the array itself, which is our temp array. In order to extract the last index of this array, the value of the last index, I'm going to use the property dot length. And then after that, I'm simply going to add a +1 to the end of this array. Okay, so that will create the new array value. So that means if this function is called when the array index is 0 and 1, then this should return us basically 2 plus 1, that is 3. And then that will become array item 3, right? So here we can remove the space so that it becomes just like this particular text that we see here in our existing array declaration. Okay, so once this particular variable is created, all we need to do is call upon the array again and then use the push method as we had discussed when we were talking about JavaScript fundamentals. And then the push method will take an input variable, which is going to be what we are trying to insert in this particular array, right? So this will take care of the insertion. And then all that we want to do is basically output the temporary array. Okay, so this is the update that is taking place. This is the update that we are trying to essentially track here. That is, the state of this array keeps on changing and the UI should be able to render it. Now, typically in traditional programs or typically in like vanilla JavaScript HTML development, if you simply call on the object of the variable, it should return us the most up-to-date value that should be present within this array. But we will see here in this situation, since we have not initialized this particular state with state management within React, the UI will not be able to render it. Okay, so we will finish off this particular component by creating the JSX body, which will be rendered on the UI itself. So until this point, everything that we have done is internal logic. So now we need to establish the logic, which will actually be displayed to the front end, right? So let us just create a div container in order to wrap all of the logic that we are going to work with. And as we just discussed, we will have a button here that will be shown on the front end UI. Every time we click on that button, this function will be called. Okay, so this is also a good tutorial to kind of understand a very simple way of setting up our event listener as well. So let us go ahead and first create the HTML-like element, which is going to be the button component. And let's close this off. It's not a self-closing tag. So here, as we discussed, anytime we want to put an event listener within React.js, we will do it by placing it as an attribute of the element, okay, and not as a separate method as we had learned in vanilla JavaScript, where we were using the add event listener method of the DOM API, and then we were connecting event listeners to it. So instead of doing that, we will do a 1:1 event listener for the element itself and not like a group-based event listener. So here, the event that we are trying to track is basically the click of a mouse button. So that attribute is on click. Okay, the only difference of this syntax versus HTML syntax is that if you had HTML, it would have been on click like this. Okay, but JSX like syntax, we are using camel casing because it is an extension of JavaScript. It's JavaScript XML. So it will be following that. So essentially what we are saying is that if you notice, we are telling the browser that if you notice that there has been a click on this button, then do something. And that do something is where we are going to essentially express the function which needs to be executed if a click takes place or if a click is identified on this particular button, right? So here we have already established this function, which will be executed if there is a click. So we are just going to take the name of that function and we are simply going to place it here. Okay, no first brackets. Please keep that in mind. That is a essential distinction from traditional programming environments. That is, when you're doing a function call, you generally call it using the first brackets as well. But here, when you're calling it, there is no first brackets. You just provide the label of the function, and that's it, right? And then we can give a leading text for our button that will be shown on the web browser. So here we can say add an item to the array. Something like this. Okay. So this is the text that will be shown on the browser itself. And that is about it. So now, after we have created this component, all that is left to be done is to basically include this particular component in the function logic. So I'm going to copy the name of this function, and I'm going to move on to app.js, which is essentially just trying to kind of consolidate all of the different custom components in the order that it needs to be called. And I'm going to place this component here with the function calling, the custom component calling syntax. So this is how it goes. And then I need to import this custom component within this particular file, just like we did for our header. So I'm just going to place a import statement with this from, and then it is not grabbing it. Okay, it is grabbing it. Okay, so this is not doing its job. So we need to write out the whole path here. So we are in the root folder, and our file is basically present in components, and it is called React State Tutorial. Okay, so it is recompiling, and there is a new error here that we are not using this particular array element that we had created, that we have set it up. So we can just, for the time being, comment it out since we are not using it. And then we can go back here and we can see that there is an item button here, which is what the rendering is giving us. So if we go back to our, where is it? React State Tutorial. This is the button that we are currently seeing here. Okay, so you can see that this is the button here. But if you notice, every time I click this, okay, essentially this function should be executed. And what this function is saying, it is pushing a new value to the array based on the creation here. Okay, but we are not seeing anything about the array on this particular element. Okay, and first of all, the reason behind that is because we don't have this new array element. This is where we need to kind of bring this person in, because it needs to iterate over this whole array as we have set it up, and then it needs to show all of the new elements. So we're going to grab this now in order to work with the warning, and the warning is now gone. So now if we reload the page, let's say, okay, if we keep on doing this, notice that we only have the first two elements of the array, which is what the declaration had. So the first time this particular component loads on our UI, so if I refresh this, this is what I always see, right? So essentially, if you look at the order of execution, this array, when this custom component is mounted on our interface, that is the word that we use when working with this React projects, this type of React projects, we mount the custom component, a new array is set up, then we create this object, which through the map method. So the map method has an iterator with a key attribute. If you do not give the key attribute, it will complain to you that, hey, I don't have any way to distinguish between all these different indexes that I'm putting into this new object here. So that is taken care of by this key attribute. And then we are setting up this paragraph environment for JSX-like syntax, and we are saving that into this particular array, right? So this is an array as well. The map method recreates a new array based on the array that you provide as an input to it. So this gets mounted on our page, right? So when this executes for the first time, that is when you mount this custom component, and that is what is rendered on the UI. So here we see that once the mount is done, we see a button, and then we see the first two items, which is based on the initialization of the array, or the initial state of the array that was passed to basically the browser, right? So that is what we're seeing. But every time now we click on this add an item to the array, logically speaking, This should call this particular function, which is basically this guy here. And then within this function, we are creating this variable, which has the input that we want to insert. And then we are using the push method. The push method inserts whatever we are passing as an argument to the very end of the array itself, right? And then it should console log the array, and it should recall the new array element, right? But there is no way to kind of recall this particular array element anymore. If you notice, because we are no longer in this area, this page needs to reload in its entirety with the updated state, that is from going from 2 items to 3 items. And then and only then it will be able to display the new items that are being added. But the beauty about React, and the reason why it has this very fast and snappy feeling, is that it does not reload the entire page like you would see happening in vanilla JavaScript, right? It does not follow that policy, right? So as a result of that, if you keep on adding these elements, nothing is essentially happening. But if we open our browser here, okay, notice that we have already moved on to 5 items. All right, so that means if I refresh this page again, and if I add these items, you can see that on the right-hand side, a 3rd item gets added. So we know for a fact that our event listener is working because of this console log statement that I have here, right? So if I keep on adding, it will keep on working just as it is supposed to, right? But notice here that this UI is unable to render the updated values. And this is a major thing in React, because if you do not use state management, then you're going to struggle in situations like this. So then the question is, how do we solve it? Well, the solution essentially requires us to use React state management, okay? So the way we are going to work with state management is, first of all, we are going to clear out all of these different functions, okay? The only thing that will remain as such or the same is basically what we are trying to render out to the browser, right? So this part will remain the same, but we need to kind of overhaul everything else within this situation, right? So we need to change this guy here. The function name will remain the same. So let me just remove this body essentially. So that will not change. So we will take out these 2 guys because we don't need this, and we cannot declare our states like this. So we need to take out this guy as well, right? This we are still creating the same way. This has nothing to do with state management. This is just saying how we want to create the new element when the button is being clicked here as an event listener logic. We need to figure out how to initialize it, and then we need to figure out how to update it using the state management initialization, okay? So if you remember, when we were discussing about state management core syntax the last time, we need to call on this React hook, which is known as useState, which is a method that is a part of the React library. So we have imported React here into this particular object. So essentially we are taking that object and we're calling that method. It's a method, right? So we will have this opening and closing first brackets. Within this method, we essentially provide what exactly are we trying to track, okay? So here is where we will set useState and connect it to the variable, object, array, whatever it is that you're trying to track, and keep updating within this particular component, inside this as a parameter, inside this as an argument. So we know for a fact that this is the array that we are trying to track. That is the initial state of the array. So we can write down the entire initial state of the array, or you can pass the array name itself. So that will kind of link it up to the particular element. So we will take this array here, which we have, and we will put this here, okay? So this allows us to initialize whatever that we are trying to track. So we are saying that this is an array, its initial state has 2 items. So please track this. Now, since this is a method, this is going to return us something back. And what a state hook returns is basically the container which will store the most up-to-date value of whatever it is that we are trying to track. In this particular case, it is our array items. And then it will also return a function which essentially is a setter function, And the goal of setter functions is to update the value of the container. Okay, so it is going to return us two different values as an array again. So what we are going to do is we are going to take the help of array destructuring, which means to extract the individual indexes of the array into individual containers, such that we don't have to use the name of the array every time we are trying to access individual indexes. Okay, so again, remember, if you have to access the first value of this array called temp array, then you would have to write temp array and then within third brackets 0. For this temp array 1. So that means every time you want to access an index, you have to call the name of the array and then the index of the array to do the computations of where that actual location is, where the value is present. But if you do not want to do that, you can use what we call as array destructuring. So what we do in array destructuring is we use a specifier, okay? And then within third brackets, we write down the individual names that we want to use to refer to those individual indexes. That is, we are providing separate labels for the index itself, such that we don't have to compute what is the location using the array indexes. Okay, so here I will say something like items. This is going to be my container that will store the most up-to-date array. Okay, so that means if it has 2 items, this will have 2 items. It has 3 items, this will return 3 items, and so on and so forth. And then we need a setter. So setter always starts with a prefix of set, and then whatever you're trying to set, which in this case is going to be set items. Okay, and then we will assign this to this function call. So essentially what is happening here is this part, we are initializing what state are we trying to track. So the state that we are trying to track, this will give an error because everything is broken right now, not a worry. So we are trying to track this array. This array will be returned and saved into this container that we are calling as items. So whatever the ultimate or most up-to-date state of the array is, we can access that through this particular container. Okay, and then it returns us a function. Remember, this is a function, even though you don't see the first brackets, this is a function essentially. And the whole objective of this particular function is to update the state of the variable, object, or array, whatever it is that you're tracking, using this useState local state management method. Okay, so now once that is set up, then essentially we need to take care of this guy at some point of time, right, to create the new indexes whenever we are adding it. But let us first go ahead and set up the update call. So here in this particular event listener is where we need to update the state of the array, because we are creating this new item text that needs to be inserted within the array whenever this button is clicked, right? So within this function body only, we need to add or update the state of our array. So previously, the way we did it is we were just calling the push method to add the element to the end of the array. But since now we are using state management, we need to use this setter function in order to update our array. We cannot use the push method as is to update the state of the array itself. So we will call the state function. So it will be set items. So that is a function. So the function is going to take input parameters. So again, you need to keep track that outside of this return statement, if you call a function, you still use the JavaScript syntax. That means you still have the first opening and closing first brackets. So please keep that in mind. Anywhere within the return statement, you make a function call, you just assign it, and React will basically figure it out that this is a function call by looking for the definition of what you have referred to here. Okay, so this is a setter function. Setter function is going to again take a callback function. Okay, JavaScript is the domain of callback functions through and through, right? So callback functions, if you notice here, the way we have set this up is there is going to be an input parameter to our arrow function notation, followed by the arrow notation, and then the body or the logic of the function, callback function, that you're trying to pass in as an argument. So what we do when we are calling the setter function is, first of all, we take the previous state. This is just a name. This is not a syntactical name. You can give any name, but this name makes the most sense is because the logic that we are saying is that take the existing state of the array and then do what? Pass it to the function body and then concatenate the previous state with the new item that you're trying to insert within this particular array. So we know that the previous state is identified by this particular variable here called previous state, right? And then the new item that we are trying to insert is being stored inside this particular variable called new item text. Okay, so that means we need to recreate a new array. So we will give the array syntaxes, and the array, the first element will be all of the previous items that was originally present in the array. So to do that, we need to do a spread operation. Okay, so there is a syntax here, and this is a syntactical operation. We give these 3 dots, which essentially represents a spread operation. So what we are doing is whatever value is there inside this, we are spreading it out. Okay, so here we are spreading out the previous state of the array. So this is what we specify. Please remember this, you're going to be seeing this very often in React projects. Okay, so essentially the whole purpose of this, what this is saying is a spread operation. It takes whatever follows and spreads it out, right? Whatever all the values that are there, it just places it there. So in a manner of speaking, this is basically a concatenation operation at the end of the day, but in a shorthand way of specifying the concatenation operation. So instead of iterating over the whole array that was there one by one, this just allows us to take these 2 values and just put it there. So in your head, when you translate this particular syntax, that is 3 dots and then the previous state operator, then all you need to think about is, okay, what is the existing state of my variable, object, or array that I'm tracking? Take all of those values and just place it one after the other, right? So that is how the replacement will take place. And then the last item that will be inserted to this particular array is basically this guy here, because this consists of the most up-to-date value. Okay, so the only thing that is left is this guy to print the most updated state of the array itself, right? So this part is going to remain the same. So let us take care of this part here, and we will say new items element or new array element. This part essentially remains the same, so not to worry about that. And what we are going to do here is we are going to take items, okay, and then we are going to map it, all right, and then we're going to put. So notice here we are not taking the name of the array itself. If you notice here, when we were creating this return value of what needs to be rendered on the UI, we were essentially passing the array itself to the map method to create those iterative objects, to create those iterative statements that would be printed. But remember, once you use state management, it's not the original container anymore that you need to use, but the container that is returned by useState. So here, useState, as we discussed, returns 2 values. One is the container, which consists of the most up-to-date values of the state that you're trying to track, and a setter function. So here, we are not using the name of the array anymore. We are essentially using the container's name or the label of the container, which is returned by useState, which will store the most up-to-date value within this particular environment. Okay, so what we place within this map is going to be exactly the same as what we have here, which is to generate this JSX-like syntax so that it can be rendered on our browser itself, right? So this is how you essentially work with this. Okay, so let us just double check this so that there is no error, and there is an error here. So we need to place another bracket here. Okay, so that takes care of the syntaxes, right? So we are taking an iterator, we are passing it, creating a key, which will be the index of the iterator itself. And then the value of the iterator will be presented in a P element that will be rendered on the browser. Okay, so there is still one error. Let us see where that error is. So it says temp array is not defined. So anywhere we are using temp array here. Where do we see temp array? Okay, so yeah. So this won't be temp error. This will essentially be items dot length. Okay, so no mentioning of temp array anymore. Temp array is passed as a parameter to useState, and then the container name that it returns, which is basically items here. You can name it whatever you would want to name it. We want to take the length of that and then +1, the same logic, right? So we are just taking a few steps more in order to track what is happening now. So if we return now to this guy here, okay, we don't need our console window. So now if we click this button, you can see that whatever update is taking place, React is able to track it. So this is the beauty of state management. And this is not just the beauty, but this is the importance of state management. And notice a fact here, the page is not refreshing. That means this component is not reloaded. The only thing that is changing here is basically the state. Whatever state is changing for the components variable that you have, that is the only thing that changes. And this is what makes React UIs much faster than traditional UIs, because React only renders the changes that is going to take place on the web page without reloading the entire page. And this is a very useful property to have for your interfaces that you're developing, because this is what makes it faster. So whenever you're dealing with a web interface which is built using React, okay, there is Vue as well, which is an alternative. Then this is the feeling that you will get essentially. Okay, so I hope you are able to appreciate the benefits that React state management brings into the picture. I hope you are able to understand the importance of requiring the need of React state management and then how it is done. And I hope you also understand how this event listener works as well, and then how we can use it to provide interactive behavior to our web pages. Okay, so that is all there is to React state management, at least the basics of it. That's not everything about it, but if you think about the basics, that's what you're working with. Okay, so let us just comment this out. We don't need this. We don't need this. Okay, and the next thing that we will work with, let's save this. This is done. Okay, so the next thing that I want to go through or go over is basically a little bit more in-depth tutorial about event listeners, and we are going to do that with the help of React forms. Okay, so we learned about HTML forms. We learned about the different components of HTML forms. And now that we understand what state management is and how state management works, I think we are in a position here to kind of create an entire HTML form. So let us go ahead and again, within the components, create a component, and we will call it touch React forms tutorial.js. Okay, so we create another React forms tutorial.js and then React functional component with an export statement to generate our boilerplate, and then we can leave it as such, right? So we will keep whatever is happening here, that's fine, and we will start working on this from this point onwards, and we will change this later on. So we know for a fact that when we are working with HTML forms, that there are many different elements that we can use, right? So if we think about HTML forms again, so the forms itself has a submit option. So you need to submit the form to probably a backend or something along these lines, right? So it will have a submit and it will have an action. That action is going to be either submit or reset and stuff like that. And then it will have some sort of an attribute which will specify the method that we are using. So the method is going to be something along the lines of, let's say, it will be either a get method, okay, web API call to read from the server, okay. So that means you're sending data with the expectation that you want some data back from the server. Then you can have different methods, like put method is there, and then you can update, you can delete, and all of these things, right? So you have these things, right? And then the last one that you have is basically post, which is the insertion operation. So read, write, update, and delete. These are the four fundamental operations that you will perform with a web API call. And then the action is basically where you would want to send it, right? Basically the URL where you want to send that form. So this will be some sort of a server URL which needs to receive depending on the type of method that you're executing, right? Within that form, and then the forms can be in the form of having to submit it. You can have a reset button within the form and things like that, right? Inside the form environment itself in HTML, we have different ways that allows user to provide input to us. So that means we can have an input text field. Okay, we can have an input field for, let's say, a text value, for password, for username, for email, for date, for file upload, and all of these different things. We talked about this when we were talking about HTML forms, right? But just to refresh the memory, that these are the different categories that we can have, right? Then we can have radio buttons, which will allow users to select one option out of many options. Then you can have checkboxes, which allows users to checkbox multiple different options. You can have things such as text area. So if you want the user to write something more than that of the input text field, and you need like a multi-line paragraph input from the user, let's say they're writing like similar to like a Facebook post, or they're writing like a blog post, or they're leaving a comment on your blog post, anything along those lines, right? So you need a bigger block of text for that situation, right? So that is like a text area and stuff like that. You can provide the user with drop-down options or multiple choice options. So there's the field for options as well. So sometimes you see that pick one from the following options, and then you click on a button, and then it gives a drop-down list, right? And then you select from one of those drop-down lists. So those are basically HTML options and stuff like that. So what we want to do here in this small example is create an HTML form, but in React.js that will allow us to get inputs from the user, right? So I will try to cover as many of those elements that I can here, okay? So the way we want to set it up is we want the users to provide the input, and we want to capture that input in a user object, okay? So the user object, when you declare an object, this is how you declare it, right? With the curly braces instead of the in array. So we can have things like the user's first name. We can grab things like the user's last name. And then let's say we take the user's email ID, and then we take the user's comments. If the user is going to provide any kind of additional description, comments, typically when you're building a website for, let's say, hotel registration or a motel registration and stuff like that, or a car rental website and stuff like that, or a food ordering website, right? You might have seen that it says that, is there any additional preferences that we need to be aware of, right? So that is kind of like what I mean by comments, right? We can have different fields, Boolean fields, like whether the user is already a registered member, whether they already have an account. So you can imagine or visualize things like that. If they have employee benefits for registering, so you can say, what is the employment status of the user? Are they employed? Do they have certain privilege level and stuff like that? And then in order to do the options part here, what we can do is we can collect some information regarding, let's say, the favorite season of the user, right? Is it winter? Is it spring and stuff like that? There is no practical motivation behind this, but you can understand here that you can easily convert this favorite season into something that is more practical, and you can provide options within those scenarios, right? With those scenarios. So if this is the set of input that we will be grabbing from the user through the help of an HTML form, so the input that will be provided is in the form of an HTML form. So what you can do is eventually, if you learn or if you understand how to do this, then you can connect this HTML form to a backend server, and you can send that information to your server, and the server can either store it in a database or do any processing based on that and stuff like that. It depends on the server logic, right? But this information will be captured from an HTML form. So the few things that we need to keep in mind here, since we are doing this, let us bring this up a little bit. Since we are implementing this using React, these values will be declared within this component here. Okay, so that means these values of this particular object will be owned by this component, and its value will change but this time not internally itself, like we did in the last example, where we were creating the array object that will be inserted to the end of the array through a user event. But here, the user event will also provide the new values. The new values will not be generated within our function. The new values will be provided by the user through a user event. Okay, so it's completely dynamic and completely interactive. Okay, even the previous one was interactive and dynamic in nature. It's just that the values were modified and generated internally rather than being provided by the user. Okay, so essentially, I believe everybody understands what is going to follow is that we need to first set up this object using state management. That is, we need to kind of track the changes and the variables that we are going to be tracking using state management. So the first step that we have to do is basically set up for state management. Okay, so any value that changes, and those values, if they need to be rendered, those updated value needs to be rendered on the web page. Remember, you need to start off with state management. That is the first step. You wouldn't do plain simple variable, object, or array declaration. You will do state declaration. Okay, so remember, the first way or the first thing that you need to do is call the React package and then call useState. Okay, and within this useState, we are going to provide the values that we want to track, or the initial state. So this value is basically a set of key value pairs within an object. So we are using the curly braces here instead of the third braces as we did the last time, the third brackets. So within this, we are going to start writing all of the different key value pairs that we are going to track, and then initialize it with the initial value as well. What is the initial value of these members? That is also something that we need to track. So as we discussed here, let me just quickly check this real quick. So first name, last name, email, comments, registration, status of the employee, and favorite season. Okay, so first name, last name. Okay, so I'm going to leave the first name as an empty string. Okay, give nothing here, and then I'm going to do the last name as an empty string as well. Is a little bit annoying. Okay, so first name, last name is done, and I think the next one was email. So we will leave the email as an empty string as well. And let's move this away. All right, so after the email, what do we have? Comments. So we are going to take comments and we are going to leave that as an empty string. And then we will have registration. So we are going to treat that as a Boolean value. Okay, since we are going to hopefully tie this up with checkboxes, either checked or unchecked, or we can even do it as a radio button as well, because at the end of the day, the radio button is a form of checkbox with just different functionality. So it's a Boolean variable, and we're going to set it to false for its initial value. For employment status, we are going to set this to an empty string again. Okay. And then finally, for our favorite season, we are going to set this as an empty string. Okay, so these values will essentially come from the React state or from the selection that the user provides within this, right? So now this will return a sub value as well. Okay, so we need to set up the container and we need to set up the setter function as well. So what I'm going to do using array destructuring, I'm going to specify the scope. I'm going to say that this is our form data. That will be the name of the container object that will store the most up-to-date value of all these forms. And then I'm going to create a setter function, which will be called as set form data. And I'm going to assign that to this particular state management. Okay, so this will allow us, so anytime that I'm going to refer to the most up-to-date form data, I'm going to call this container. And anytime I need to update the value of these object key value pairs, then I will call this setter on this form data. So basically, I will not refer to this object. The object name now is form data, which is now being tracked by my state functionality. Okay, so once that is done, after this, if you notice, where is that? In the state tutorial, once we set up this particular state operation, So this was this one. The next thing that we had is basically the function logic of what needs to be done once the input is provided or once the event listener is activated by the user. Okay. But before we do this one, what we should do is first of all set up our return statement, or what is the components, or what is actually what are we actually trying to show to the users in this return statement. So I'm going to remove this first, and then I'm going to set up an environment, a multi-line environment, where I can start working on these different stuff, right? So whenever we realize that there's going to be an event or there is going to be some sort of an event listener that needs to be implemented, we're going to code it here first, but we are going to keep a track of it, because between these two areas, that is state management setup versus this return statement, we need to write our event listeners. So here we will say define all event listeners below. And here we will say, right before this return statement, we will say define your JSX elements. Okay, so this is what will be rendered on the UI. Okay. And here we have a state management. So the documentation kind of is structured here. Okay. So the first thing that we want to set up is a form environment. That is the first thing that we want to work with, because we are treating this whole input behavior that we are going to set it up as an input form. So I'm going to set up a form environment, and the form environment will have some sort of event listener that will be associated with it. Okay. And then we need to do something when that event listener gets activated. So again, since we have an on submit event, let us go ahead and create a event listener that will be for the submission option. Okay, that will be taking care of the submission option. So here we will say handle submit, something along these lines. So function handle form submit. Okay, so you can say either handle form submit, or you can give handle on submit, whatever that is that you want to say. And then any kind of event listener is capable of taking an event parameter object that has further information. And then you will have the body of that function as to what you need to do. Now, this is where you connect to your backend using API calls. This is the location where you will essentially put the server-side code of connecting with your API. This is a little bit different when you're working with things like technologies such as, let's say, vanilla JavaScript, or technologies such as PHP, where in order to connect to the server, you essentially have to use these attributes that we were talking about for our HTML forms, right? So that is a little bit different. Here, when you connect to your backend, you have to make API calls. So the way you are going to tie it up is that, okay, if the form is submitted, then I'm essentially going to call this event handler function. And within the body of this function, I'm going to provide any sort of API calls using the URL of where that server is hosted, and then the method that should be used in order to either activate a read request, write request, update request, or a delete request and stuff like that, right? So we will leave this empty because we have no server right now, right? And then we can further carry on working with our other stuff, right? So this, again, this is annoying. Okay, so let's put some content here so that it does not remove our first and second multi-line brackets that we are trying to put here. So anytime we create an input field, right? So if we create an input field here, if you remember from HTML, input is a self-closing tag. So we cannot write any text as we did here. If you notice here in the React State tutorial, for the button, it was not a self-closing tag. So we were able to provide a label here, which was shown on the UI. If you're working with your input tag, then it's a self-closing tag. You cannot provide any kind of statement there. So you need to create a label for your input tag such that you have some sort of a leading data associated to the input field that you're creating. Okay, so that means we have to first, before we work with our input tag, create a label. Okay, and the label, if you remember from HTML, had an attribute called for, which essentially connects it to the actual input field that you're working with, right? But here we cannot use for, the keyword for, because if we write for, it will think that you're trying to write a function. You will try to think that you're trying to code your loop, right? So there is a change here. Since this is a reserved keyword, this will change to HTML for, so that JSX can understand, or this engine can basically understand that you're using the for attribute from HTML and not the for reserved keyword for writing a loop, right? So here you need to provide it with a name. So let's say the name that we provided, that the label that I'm creating is for first name input, and make sure that we use the same ID for the input field when we work with it, right? So we're going to set this up, and then we can write a label here, which will be shown, such as enter first name. All right. And then we will close out our label. Boom, done. All right, so now we can come and set up the input field. So first of all, let us give it a class name, just to identify what is happening. So I can say that this is going to be a textual input. So I'm just going to say text input. Then let me give it an ID. So the ID that I will provide is basically the label that I have given upstairs, which is the first name input. Okay, and once the class name and the ID is done, we need to specify what type of input field this is going to be. So I'm not going to call any kind of function or assign any variables here. So I'm just simply going to say that this is going to be a text field. So that kind of expresses it. If you want to give a leading placeholder text, so that whenever our custom component mounts on the web page, it will show something there. So we can say enter your first name here. Okay, so we can give something like this. This needs an event listener that needs to be associated with it. So that means here we are trying to track keyboard presses. Okay, so if you're trying to track keyboard presses, then it's not on click. The one that we use here is basically on change. Okay, so that means if any changes takes place within this field, we would want to perform some operation. So here we are just going to say, we'll give it some name. It's just a function name. So we have to give a handle change function name. So here we need to essentially declare that function as well. So this is the name of the function. Okay. And the parameters that it will take is the event parameter, which is identified by this E. And then for now, let us just leave it as some sort of console log and then some sort of a test message for event handler. Okay, we will fill this up when we are done coding this entire HTML form body, JSX-like form body. Okay, then we need to give it a name. Okay, this is the name that will be used when it will be grabbed by this event parameter. It will be able to identify this particular field. ID doesn't work, last name doesn't work. So essentially we need a name here, a name and a value. So what will be the identifying name when this particular field is sent within this function body? That will be identified by this name. And then it will also have a value. So that means within this function body, when we are trying to extract the actual value that is stored inside this input text field, which is provided by the user, that will be captured by the value. Okay, so here the name that we will give it is basically going to be first name, because that is what we are trying to grab from the users. Okay, this is what the field is for. And then it needs a value here. Now, this is an interesting thing that will happen. Okay, where is the value of first name? Can you guys identify what is the initial value of the first name and where it is stored? Can you guys think about it real quick?
Is it just null because it's
no. So think about it. Where is the value stored, the initial value? Where have we declared the initial value of first name in this code? Where's the declaration? Look at the code. This is all the code that we have. Where do you see the initial declaration of the key member first name? Do you guys notice? Where have we declared all our variables? Here, right? Does everybody agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you call or how do you refer to a particular key within an object? What is the syntax for that? If you have an object with many members and then you're trying to extract a single member, then how do you do that? You take the name of the object first, and then what do? Object dot operator followed by the key, right? So where is the key for the first name? Here. And then what is the name of the object that encloses this key? If you tell this, then you will be able to understand, or you are understanding state management. Which container should I refer to in order to extract the most up-to-date value of all of these different key members?
Is it form data?
Correct. Right. So form data, this is the object container which wraps using state management around all of these different key members. So that means if I'm trying to initialize this value of this input text field with the most up-to-date value or the initial value, which is what we have currently because we don't have any interaction of first name, then we need to first refer to the container that stores that value that will give us the most up-to-date value. So this will be form data, right? Because that is what we specified here using state management. You can see here, if I kind of hover over form data, Visual Studio Code shows us what form data is wrapping, right? It shows us all of those things, right? And now we know that this is an object. So in order to refer to any individual key value, we just need to use the dot operator. And you can see that I already am getting all of these different wrappers or all these different key values that are provided there, right? So, and that's it. When you're done, all you need to do now is basically close this particular input field and then hit save, and it will prettify everything. And this is basically how you deal with an input label, right? So let us set this up. Let us copy this component first, and let us tie it up to our app.js real quick. So I'm going to go here, write down the syntax for making a custom component call. All right. And then I need to now import it as well. So save this guy. It will give an error. Sure, why not? Import. And then we need the same name from, and then we will have // within components. We have React state, not state, React forms tutorial, and then save this. Okay. We have some value set form data. We are not using it yet. So that is fine. Not a problem there. Okay. So if we go here, we can see that we have this enter your first name. We just need some CSS styling here. But essentially what we can do is, let us see if we can just do this in order to do a sanity check whether our handle change works or not. Okay. So here is the message. So this should essentially what we should be seeing here. So if we do an F12 here, reload the page real quick, and if we start typing here, so we can see that this test message is shown, but pay attention to this counter here, which is tracking all the different changes that is happening here. So it is doing that, but notice that this field does not show anything. Okay, so that is an important thing, because this is directly tied up to the behavior of the form environment. So this is a very common area of hitting errors when you're working with HTML forms. The default behavior, and pay very close attention to what we are discussing right now. Okay, otherwise you will think that you made an error and you will break your head probably like hours and hours trying to fix it. You will see nothing wrong is happening and you will not know why that is the case. So the reason why here, even though I'm typing something, you can notice here this counter will keep on increasing anytime I type, because I'm tracking the changes. So if I type my name here, you can notice here that this counter is incrementing one after the other. Every time I type something, it is incrementing. But notice nothing is showing up here on the text field that we're typing on. The only thing that we see is basically this placeholder text and nothing else, right? So nothing else is being shown here. So what is up here, right? And the reason why this is happening, why this happens essentially, is whenever you set up this form environment and put any of these input fields, text area, whatever it is that is allowing you to collect the information from your users, if you put a submit button on the form, the default behavior of how this form is going to function here is to refresh anytime a change takes place. Whether or not you're sending it to a server, that is a different story altogether. But the default behavior of the form is to refresh anytime you do any kind of changes within this particular form, right? So the problem with that is that means that if it refreshes every time there is a change, anytime I'm typing something, you can see that the counter is increasing again, but it refreshes. And since it refreshes, we lose that information. And due to the refresh, this particular input field reloads again. And since it reloads, it loses the data that has been given there. This is not state management related, but this is just the behavior of input forms. You will see the same situation happening in HTML as well if you do not stop this behavior. So in order to stop this behavior, we need to go to this handle form submit, because this is the event listener logic, which is essentially tracking or controlling the behavior of this form element itself. So we need to take the event object, which is E, and we need to call a method that is known as prevent default. Okay, so DEFAULT. Okay, so this is a method here. So essentially this will override the default behavior of our form data, right? So here we can say form data in order to do a sanity check of what is happening with respect to our form behavior as well. Okay, so essentially now the form will not submit the data one after the other if you hit the submit button. Okay, so let us complete this whole behavior in order to set everything up and in order to kind of write down all of the things. So I'm going to do the same thing. So for our text area, for our last name input, so here we can see we have last name, first name, and email. So these three different behaviors are going to be designed the same way as you have designed first name here. So I'm going to copy paste it from my existing code rather than typing same things with different behavior. Okay, so let us just copy this. And it's going to be the same thing. It's just going to change the labels everywhere. So here you can see that I have changed the label for last name input and entered the last name. I have a class name, which is text input. So it belongs to the same class, but I've given it a different ID. I've given it a different name, and it is referring to the different key member of our form data, which is the object that is being tracked by our state management. If things change, it is still referring to the on change, the handle change function that we have created here. For now, it just has a placeholder console log message and nothing else. Some placeholder information about entering the last name. Similarly, for email, we change the type to email from type text. Okay, and everything else just changes based on the information that you are working with. So that is all there is to it, right? So if you want to do a text area, so now remember that the environment for text area is basically text area, and the rest of the stuff remains the same. That is, it is still a textual input, just like we have for our input field. So we will have information such as if you want to give a placeholder, you can give a placeholder. You will have a event listener here, which is again going to be on change because you're tracking keyboard presses. You will have some initial value, and that initial value needs to be connected to our state management variable or object in this particular case, and things like that. So we will go ahead and work with that text area. Okay, so initial value, placeholder, event listener, which is basically tracking any changes that is happening to this particular field, and then the label, the name that will be grabbed by the event parameter, which we are calling as comments itself. Now, the things or how it will change from this trend is when you start working with checkboxes. Okay. The reason why things start to change a little bit from checkboxes is because checkboxes do not have any initial value. Okay, just like this can have some string data here, right? In its value. It may have if you assign it. Right now, it is an empty string, right? Checkboxes do not have a set value. So you cannot really put a value in checkboxes. So the behavior of checkboxes is going to be a little bit different compared to how you are going to work with fields like input text fields and stuff like that. Okay, so the way we are going to work with is not use a checkbox environment. We are going to use the input as again, but we are going to provide a type of checkbox. That's how we work with checkboxes here. So we're going to create this input field. Let us close it off right away so that we don't forget it later on. Let us provide it with an ID and let us say if the employee is registered or not. So we're just going to provide this particular ID. Now in the type, we are going to say that this is going to be a checkbox. Okay, and not a text, not an email, not a password, but this is going to be a checkbox. Now, where it starts to differ from regular input fields is that we need to provide an attribute called checked, whether it is checked or not. Now, how do we know this information, whether this particular field of is registered is checked or not? We need to again refer to our container, which stores the updated value of our check field. So we need to go to form data dot is registered. Then if this is true, this will be the checkbox will be checked. If this is set to false, the checkbox will be false itself. So here, when we set this up, when we are checking if the checkbox is checked or not, we essentially need to connect this to our state object, which is form data. And then in form data, we are going to call the key member, which is tracking the value for our checkbox. Okay. After that, we need to provide it with our event listener, which is going to be on change. Essentially, if the checkbox changes or not, if the behavior changes or not, it becomes true or it becomes false. So we're just going to tie it up to handle change function again that we have written. So we are going to, have this one-stop function to manage all of the different events rather than writing different event listener function logic for every event that is happening. This is all the similar type. So we are just going to deal with this. And then we need to give it a name. So I'm going to opt for is registered. That is the name that will be grabbed by our event listener. Okay. And then of course, we need to provide it with a label, and the label, essentially you can put whatever label you want to kind of show for the particular checkboxes. So again, label will have an HTML for, which is what the label is. And I'm going to tie it up to this guy here, this name ID here. So I'm just going to copy paste this here. And then once that label is done, we are going to essentially place in the text that will be shown on the browser. So we can say, do you already have an account with us? Something like this, right? So if you set this up, then we can set this up. So if we go here, then we can see here all the things are coming together, where all the fields, all the different fields that we have are coming together. We did not provide a label for this text area. So we can see here, we just have this field here and then nothing else that is happening within this area. Remember, for text area, you can also control within your attributes what is going to be the initial number of lines that will be displayed on the browser to begin with. Otherwise, it will pick a default value. So you do have the options to kind of, increase the size and not. But if you want to present an area of which is like this width or something like that, you can use the attributes in order to specify those whole thing, right? So other than that, let us stop here with the generation of this, and let me show you what are the other fields that we are essentially using. Okay, so for radio buttons, okay, so we only have two more fields that are left within this particular label. So we have a radio button, so we can do the employment status, and then the last one that remains is basically what are your favorite seasons and stuff like that. So the way we are going to do this is we are going to use an HTML element. This is less of a course on React.js per se, but this is like a revision of HTML forms and how it is done in React.js. So the main thing that you have to remember is that the values that we are specifying here. So for example, here there is no value. It is called checked. In these input fields, we have these updated values. So you can provide values here as well. Okay, this is where it is. This is where it is. This is where it is. So what changes in React.js from HTML is that these value fields needs to be connected to your state management container. And the way you are calling your event listeners is a little bit different compared to how you would do it if you're coding in HTML and JavaScript, right? So this is the main change you have to focus. Everything else, we're just rewriting it using the syntaxes for our what do you call it? Our syntaxes in React.js, okay? So it's similar to like rewriting the HTML elements using JSX syntax, but you can see here there is not much of a difference. So when working with radio buttons, I'm using this HTML element called field set. Field set gives us a set of options here. So let us just move on to this guy here. So this is what a field set looks like. So let us remove this guy. So you can see this boundary here that is showing this set of options that is being provided here. Okay, so this is basically a field set. So what the field set allows us is to provide a legend, and that legend is going to be the text. And then within that, we can set up all our radio button information here. So this field set is this enclosed environment. This is an HTML aspect. The legend is what is associated to the set of options that will be shown within that particular field set. Okay. And then when you're setting up a radio button as compared to checkboxes, you have to first of all set the type to radio, provide it with an ID if you want to set up a label for this particular field, give it a name because that is the name that will be grabbed when the event listener is executed. So you need to know what field you're dealing with. It wouldn't be input field, because all of these fields are input fields. So you need to know exactly what you're working with. So you provide this label here, this name. The value that we provide is unemployed, okay? And then the on change is the event listener. Notice here how we are not connecting anything to the state management because there is nothing to kind of control that behavior with respect to the state management, right? So we are just saying that these are the different values. And this is the HTML JavaScript behavior that we had seen before when we were working with HTML forms, that if we provide an inline value, so this is not calling any object and key member, it's an inline value that you're providing here. So anytime the user clicks one of these particular check radio buttons, and eventually when they hit the submit button, because this is an entire form environment, so it will take everything that is wrapped within this particular form and it will send it to the server or wherever it is that you're trying to send it, or capture it in your own local storage and stuff like that. So in that situation, the way we have coded this is that it will take this value and it will send it, right? So it's not tracking any kind of changes with respect to this particular value, okay? Similarly, the last aspect that we have is this drop-down menu where you can allow the users to select from one of the existing options that you provide here, okay? So the way that you do it here is basically you click on this option or you code it using this option element, okay? And each of these option element have the value that represents the menu choices that you are providing. So that means when the user selects a particular menu choice and then they are going to go forward with it, okay? Then when they hit the submit button, whatever the final menu choice option that the user provided here, that is what that value will be. And that value will be sent to the event listener, okay? With the e.target.value. And e.target will essentially be this entire select option, okay? So select sets up this environment where you can provide a drop-down option. And then for each of the options that you have, that you see here on this particular interface, those options are coded using the HTML element of option, which has a value, and then the leading text that will be rendered on the web browser. And then finally, at the very end, we have a submit button, which will end the form, right? So when you click the submit button, that will essentially activate this on submit action that we have on the form itself, right? So the last thing that remains here is to basically update the state management area and use the setter that we have, All right. So now notice here in this, so this is the handle change. This is the event listener function that we are going to call for every different actions that we have on this particular page, right? So that is what we are trying to track. Now, since we have connected this event listener function to multiple different events, the event type is still the same. We're just tracking the changes that is taking place to the field. But notice here that the different types are different. So we have some kind of a textual type, then we have names, then we have values that is coming from the event, right? And then there is a separation here. That is when we are working with our checkboxes, we don't have a value. We have an attribute called checked itself. So what we need to grab from all of these different fields is basically the content that we need and to perform our operations with respect to the event. So essentially we need the value, we need the name, we need the type of input field that it is. And then the only difference that is going to be, since this particular input field, when you're working with checkboxes, does not have a value, we have to grab the checked attribute itself, right? So first of all, from the event listener parameter, which is this E, and then E.target refers to these each individual fields that we have. We want to destructure and extract those individual attributes that are wrapped within that particular element, right? So once I do this, you will understand what I'm trying to say here. So I'm going to get the name, I'm going to get the value, and I'm going to get the type. And then since checkboxes does not have any value, it has a checked attribute. I'm going to grab that checked attribute as well. So this is the syntax for object destructuring. That is, instead of doing object name dot key value, instead of doing that, I'm just extracting them into their individual containers. Okay. And where do I get that information from? From the event parameter object. And it has a member called target. Within that, it has. So if I did not write this particular code, anytime I would want to refer to the name or the value, let's say, for example, of the input field that I am working with when this particular event listener is executed, then I would have had to write this whole thing as e.target.name. So that is a very lengthy way to kind of refer to a particular element. All right. So once I have extracted everything, before I update the value, which is stored inside this state container, right? This state container has all the values. It should contain all the updated values. So that means I need to use this setter to access this object and then update it with the input values that the user has provided, right? So the first step is to call the setter. Right? Well, not the first step. That is the essentially that's the only step that you have to do within this particular operation here. So, right. So I need to call setFormData, which is my setter. And again, if you remember from our state tutorial, whenever you call the setter, where is it? Okay. Whenever you call the setter, the parameter of the setter is going to be a callback function. And within the callback function, you're going to take the previous state, spread the previous state, and then tie it up with the new state. A note here, if you do not spread the previous state, that is, if you do not pass the previous state as an input argument to your callback function and then spread the previous state, or in a way of saying just concatenate it with the new state, then the new state will overwrite the previous state. Please make a note of this. This is an important piece of information. That is, if you do not track the previous state when you're calling the setter, then the new value will overwrite the original values. Okay, so that means if I didn't do this in this particular operation, then the array would be reduced to a size of length 1, because it will overwrite that entire array with whatever that you're trying to insert. So since I'm doing a concatenation operation, it spreads the previous state, all the values that are there, and then adds the new item. So that means if here I do not take the previous form data, then I will lose all of the information that is there in the previous form data. So if you do not want some sort of a, so to speak, version control, then do not include the previous data or the previous state. If you want to track everything that has happened, okay, then you need to include the previous date. So here I will include the previous form data. This is just a name that I'm giving to kind of identify that I am also tracking the previous form data. I'm going to pass that into the logic of my function. It is going to be a multi-line function, so I will wrap it in curly braces. And what do I need to do? I would like to return from this function basically the spread of all of my previous form data. Again, the 3 dot is basically called a spread operator. All it does, it just pastes all of the previous values that are stored in the particular state container. Okay. In addition to that, what I want to do is, if I need to do two things here. Okay. If I have a regular input field, for example, a radio button or a text field or an email field or a text area, if I have any of these, I will return the value of whatever the user entered. Okay. If I have a checkbox, then the checkbox doesn't have a value, so I cannot return a value. So for that particular scenario, I need to return whatever the checked attribute is, either true or false, right? So first of all, I'm going to return the name so that I can identify it, but then I need to check what is the type of that input field that we are dealing with. So I need to check if that type is equals to a checkbox or not. Okay. If that type is triple equals to a checkbox, then I will return the checked attribute. If it is not a checkbox, then I will return simply the value of that particular attribute. Okay. And then essentially that marks the end of our return statement. Okay. So this is not going to be this. This is essentially going to be this. Okay. So this is how I'm going to return the whole thing. So this will be a semicolon here. This will stop the body of the callback function. And then we will put a semicolon here. This will mark the end of the setter function. Okay. And this marks the end of the main function, which is the event handler function. Again, to repeat what we just did here, we take the event parameter. The event parameter essentially abstracts all the information that is associated to the field or to the element to which that event listener is associated with, right? So that means whenever I write something like this and I call this function, then this function will receive as input arguments all of these different things that you see that we have written here. So that means the name, the value, the type, the class name, ID, the placeholder text. It will grab everything that is there along with the data the user provides. So it will grab just everything. So the data that user provides will be stored here. This is the label, this is the type, and all of these things will be grabbed. That you can access by calling this key member called target. So whichever element calls that event listener is the target element, right? So that means the event object will be able to access that by calling e.target. Now, e.target has a set of nested objects, and within that nested objects is where you store all of these different attributes. That is the attributes in the form of name, value, which is the value that will be storing the user inputs and stuff like that, the type that you have declared as a developer. And the reason why we have checked is because checkboxes don't have any value. Checkboxes has an attribute called checked itself, which is either going to be true and false. So we take all of those, we destructure them, store them into these individual variables so that we don't have to use the object notation to call those particular values. Then we need to update our container because that is where we plan to save all of our values. When we send it to the server, we can just take this container and we can send this container to the server, and that will have the most up-to-date value. We know that for a fact, right? So here we call the setter. The setter always has a callback function within itself. We create an iterator, which is going to iterate over all of the existing values within our container. Okay. Then we return from that callback function a spread or a copy paste of all of the existing values within the setter container or within the state container, and concatenate it with the name of the element which has called this particular event listener function. And we are checking here. So this is a ternary operator. What we are checking here is that if the type of the target that has called this particular event listener function is a checkbox, then after the name, print the checked attribute. If it is not, then print the value attribute. Okay, so that is basically the logic of this particular function that we are working with, right? So now if you check this out on your own time, you can reload this particular page. So essentially all of the information that will be carrying out here, whatever you're going to be working with, whatever you're going to select here, write some comments. Okay, write some comments. So notice here now the changes are being tracked because it is being controlled by the state management. Previously, if you had noticed, we were not seeing anything there, right? And this page doesn't get refreshed because we are basically stopping the default behavior that we had of our form. So here we can give some name. We can say ABC. We can go here, type DEF. For email, we need to have specifically abcemail.com. We wrote some comments here. Do you have an account with us? Let us check this up, fall, and then hit submit, right? So the moment we hit submit here, the reason why we see this is because the handle form submit is going to do a console log. That is all we have. You need to replace this console log with a call to your server. If you do that, that means you have sent your data to the server. And this is what we see. This is what we have grabbed it. And the reason why we see this is because this is being tracked by state management. So two important things that is happening here is to make sure you set up state management whenever you're dealing with user input, because that data will be controlled within this particular functional component. And if you need to track anything that happens within a functional component's variable or object, you need state management. That is basically what you have to do. All right. If you're working with event listeners for data that is coming from users, you need to update those values by using the setter that is provided by your state management. If you do not do that, you will see nothing in a React-based UI. You are not going to see any updates, right? Even though internally it is working just fine, you will not see anything that is happening there. So please review these two pieces of functional components that we discussed today. It is very essential for you to establish your understanding of these concepts for you to be able to create your own project and your own stuff as well, right? So we will wrap up here for today. And in the next class, we will finish off the actual meme generator app by implementing these concepts that we learned today and basically executing the logic of the design that we had discussed about how to do the meme generator app with the final piece of the puzzle, which is how to make API calls. Okay, so we'll wrap up here. And if you have any questions, do let me know at any time. All right, thank you.